Welcome to the Sales Scholars podcast, where we talk to academic experts about anything and everything sales related. Well, this week we're talking to Dr. Ryan Mullins, the director for Clemson University's Sales Innovation Program. Now, Ryan also teaches personal selling, sales management, and sales leadership. And he's the co-author of the textbook, Professional Selling. Now, Ryan's work has appeared in several top-tier journals, and his research work with multiple Fortune 500 companies has made Ryan an insightful speaker and accomplished trainer. Today, we're going to talk about digital sales readiness and what your company should be thinking about before investing in technology. And so, Ryan, man, we're so glad you could join us.
Greg, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Thanks for asking me on.
Oh, man, no problem. I know you've got a little bit of a history with certainly the U of H team, but then also doing amazing things out at Clemson. So I thought maybe the best place to start is, tell us a little bit about the work you do at the Clemson Sales Innovation Program, and then how you got into the academic world.
Sure thing. So let's start with the Sales Innovation Program. We are in the big scope of sales programs, we're a new kid on the block for sure. We started our first formal year in operation this last year, and I know we had a little chance to talk about it offline, that it was quite an entrepreneurial venture for us to get off the ground. And so as the director of the Sales Innovation Program, I've been overseeing our initial partnerships, getting our curriculum set up, getting our faculty all set up to provide a really strong curriculum for our students to be great sellers.
To me, that's one of the best parts about all this, is how much you get to work with students in a variety of venues.
And I think that in sales programs in particular, you really get to see students in a lot of crucible moments, right? You're seeing them take on some things that are can be very challenging. We're talking about public speaking opportunities in a lot of these that are sales role plays, right? And so for a lot of them, especially early on, those that are not accustomed to sales, that can be a pretty daunting task. And so you get to see a lot of evolution with these students going through that, and they love it and they appreciate it, and that's a great part of the job for sure.
Yeah, no, that's cool. So yeah, how did you get into the academic world?
It's a great question, Greg. So I'm a bit of an atypical guy in our field. I was originally an engineer by training in my undergrad. So I was an aerospace engineer coming out of Texas A&M, and then went to work for Boeing up in Seattle, and was really in a role of a technical sales liaison there, translating a lot of our wind tunnel testing, materials, composite testing into presentations for airlines. And I got kind of my first taste of really being customer facing with airlines in that role, and it really got me interested in being more on the business side of the house. So ended up going back to get my MBA at A&M, and during that time I just started asking a lot of questions with professors, and they actually steered me towards thinking about a PhD in marketing and sales. And with that kind of frame in mind, U of H came up really high on the list very quickly with that type of PhD focus. And so that brought me over to U of H, brought me over to work under Dr. Mike Ahern, and got to really dive into the sales program there at U of H, and been at Clemson since 2012 coming out of there. And that's kind of been my story so far. Okay.
That's cool. Yeah, I have the various people I've talked to. I don't think that I've talked to any engineers by trade who ended up in the sales world.
I've loved it because my background and the way I think is very process driven, right? I like things to be orderly and to know how things all work together systematically, but also at a detailed level. And so just starting to teach sales process, teach methodology, and teach fundamentals to students is it's really great for me to help them convey and translate to see how selling is not this mystical art, right? There is a method, there are principles that we follow that help us be more successful. Clearly there's lots of variables out there, but there's best practices that we can use to help us be successful day in and day out. And I think I've loved making that translation for students, especially ones from maybe non-business backgrounds, right? That maybe are a little skeptical towards thinking about sales at first. So that's been a real fun part of the job.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's funny. You seem to focuses me on that whole art and science of sales.
Yep.
I'd always describe it that what you're talking about, the process and the methodology is kind of the science piece, and then the art is okay, hey, individual person, how you do this? How do you say these things? How do you do something in a way that you can feel confident and comfortable to a degree? But follow the process.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love you brought that up, because I feel like that gives the individual side of everybody to come out to that, right? And that value and the way they would deliver the message.
Brian, I know that you've been recently doing some work on kind of digital selling and this idea of evaluating readiness with organizations. What do you think are some of the key indicators that suggest a company is really positioned well to succeed in digital selling?
So great question. I think readiness is definitely what we want to capture, and what our studies have shown us is that there's a few factors, essentially a few questions that sales leaders should be asking their salespeople if they want them to be taking on digital selling. We have to start reminding ourselves that when we're asking a lot of sellers, especially experienced sellers, to start embarking on a digital selling transformation, this is not just adding a piece of technology to their repertoire, right? This is a big overhaul, and essentially it's a new way of creating value with their customers. And so we have to really dive down and start having really good conversations, or at least an assessment or evaluation with our sellers, to know whether they're ready to take this on, whether they're ready to start implementing these new behaviors. So the first question I would have sales leaders ask their salespeople is, what value do you see in digital selling? Do you see the need, and do you see yourself developing a preference for using these tools? One of the things that happens with a lot of organizations is that sellers get accustomed to the way they've sold before. Maybe they're accustomed to in-person, especially outside people, really accustomed to in-person, face-to-face, and they feel like they're losing a lot. They don't see the value in having any options or doing social, using an analytical tool to guide some of the ways they go after new prospects. So first thing you have to understand is, do they see the need and value of implementing that digital selling approach?
Do you see, just out of curiosity, on that need and value thing, have you ever seen any variation, like whether it's amongst industries or amongst certain types of salespeople, where they might be less inclined versus others?
The thing we have to think about first is what would be new in a particular industry or to a particular generation. And I think some of the things that are newer to certain generations are, like, let's take social networking platforms, right? Generationally, you've got a younger audience that's going to be much more familiar with that, much more familiar with how to connect with somebody, much more accustomed and comfortable in seeing the value of how to connect with that, and maybe even build a conversation with that. So you've already got off the bat, you've got an intergenerational difference there.
Yeah.
I think industry-wise, I would expect that clearly some of your technological industries have been much quicker to adapt these, just because they're part and parcel of what they're selling day to day anyway. Some of your more industrial, mechanical, manufactured goods folks that don't have as much familiarity, or don't have as much time really and experience with these types of digital selling tools. I use social networking a lot. It's a really clear example, but I think some of the other ones we would think about are like just-in-time presentation tools that actually allow you to customize and configure products right there on the fly, maybe on an iPad or some type of tablet, right? And that in an industrial space where the complexity of the product is going to be really great, it's going to take longer for that type of solution to maybe be in place. And so I think you've seen some sales organizations really drag their feet on those types of innovations, because they're going to be costly and they're going to be significant overhaul. but clearly in the climate that we're in now, that everybody's doing it virtually, there's been a lot of urgency behind getting those capabilities put in place now. So those
Yeah,
are some of the trends I see out there.
yeah, no, that's good. And I've seen industries that historically seem to not embrace digital as much at minimum are starting to kind of look into it.
Hmm.
Um, Even in the B2C world, where most of the digital has been e-commerce only, you're
Hmm.
starting to see more people looking at outreach strategies and how to leverage tools to, find prospects. One of the things you mentioned earlier was the idea of like using analytical tools.
Yeah.
I think is kind of one of those things that doesn't often get considered in this digital selling strategy. Maybe tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that.
Well, let's take like a machine learning principled approach to this, right? So we can actually use a machine learning approach to help us learn who the right prospects are to go after. What are the factors that tell us the likelihood that this certain type of customer would be more likely to buy from us, or would be more likely to even be an upsell or a cross sell opportunity, right?
Hmm.
So an analytical capability that we could classify under digital selling that would be a tool salespeople could leverage to guide their prospecting or guide their cross sell conversations.
Yeah,
But clearly that's a bit of you've got to have the human resources in a lot of ways to enable that capability, and then you've got to now translate that and get your sales force to understand how to use it. Right. So
yeah.
couple challenges there, and getting that type of implementation in place.
Yeah, the idea of hey, they know it, but will they do something with it? I think that's like always in the front of the sales leader's challenge, for
Yeah.
sure.
And some of it's just demystifying it, right? We've artificial intelligence is this big scary word, and it's been hawked too much as replacing salespeople and not supplementing, helping salespeople be better, right? And I think what we're going to see coming down the road more and more is that the ability to build trusting relationships will continue to be more and more important as the routine tasks, the things about which customers to go after will be taken more out of the salespeople's hands, which I think is helpful for everybody. Really, I would be hard pressed to find a seller that wants to do a bunch of routinized tasks where they're essentially just having to crunch numbers or research. They want to go sell. They want to go and be in front of customers. So I think the more we can enable them to have more time doing that, the better off everybody's going to be.
Yeah, yeah. I know. I agree. So if I'm a sales leader and I'm trying to look at my organization in terms of digital selling readiness,
Hmm.
what would you suggest for some of the things that I need to be looking at?
So like I said earlier, we want to make sure salespeople see the value in it. Okay, and that's just through conversations, manager to salespeople, right?
Yeah.
I think the second thing is what kind of investment have you made in training? Do your salespeople feel supported, and do they feel like ongoing support in training for those digital tools? Because what we see is this is not an approach that we can do a day or a week of training and expect them to be able to implement it going forward. It's going to be ongoing, and it's going to be a lot of variance in terms of who's going to need support. So I think you're going to see a growth in just-in-time training, smaller modules where people can check out how to do a certain digital tool, whether it be analytics, whether it be social selling, and continue to use those as they need them. And then I think the last thing leaders need to have on hand is they need to have the use cases where salespeople have been successful. They need to be able to show and help other sellers see the success that they can have by taking these approaches. Because one thing is seeing the value in it. The other thing is actually seeing whether or not somebody in their organization that used it was successful in meeting their goals.
Yeah. No, that's really good. Actually, it's interesting that a bit of that formula on readiness, like you said, I think you mentioned this earlier. Hey, it's not about the technology, although the technology is a part of it. But the formula you listed out was this idea of how do they think about it now? What type of training, and then some examples. And to a degree, I think that's been a good formula for anything sales related from a kind of a change initiative standpoint.
Absolutely. And I think the other nuance to this that I think is different from other technologies is also thinking about marketing and marketing's role with sales on this. Marketing, and digital selling especially, marketing plays a pretty integral role with sales. And sales leaders have to ask themselves, what's your relationship like with the marketing function? As a lot of us know, a lot of sales and marketing organizations do not get along for one reason or another.
Yeah.
And that type of conflict, those types of dynamics actually make digital selling a lot harder. Even what we're finding in some of the research we've done is that conflict there, especially when you're going handoffs, when you have handoffs between what marketing has created and done in demand generation to help salespeople be more successful. If there's conflict there, you see salespeople having a lot of distrust, and this is the classic, the leads aren't any good, right? This is really where that comes from. And so I want leaders to also be thinking about what's the dynamic with marketing on this, because marketing is going to play an absolutely critical role in digital selling implementation.
Yeah, that's actually a great point about, in an organization, if there's tension today between sales and marketing, it doesn't sound like that the tension goes away if you start on a digital selling effort. In fact, it sounds like it could be exponentially more tense unless somebody addresses it directly.
Things will get worse before they get better, certainly.
Yeah. As you've done some research on this topic and looked at some organizations, have you seen any best practices or anything in particular that you felt like really enabled an organization to do this digital selling thing well?
I think one of the first things I've seen done well is managers having a very tangible idea on what they should be watching to know that implementation is taking place. So that's different for every organization, right? And I think this is where a lot of sales organizations get hung up a little bit is what is it that I should be looking for to know we're succeeding? So if you've got an analytical tool, are you having those pipeline conversations to talk about use of that tool for targeting and use of that tool to fill top of the funnel, right? If you are implementing if you have social selling as a proactive tool to prospect and generate leads or build relationships, what are you doing to monitor that? Do you have a KPI for number of meetings generated from networking platforms? And so there has to be, what I've seen in organizations that are doing this well and seeing success is they've got really applicable KPIs to track the use of these digital selling tools.
Okay.
The ones that they have identified as strategically relevant for them. And I think that's where some of the tough part comes in, is because you can look at one organization and see what they're measuring, and it may not fit what your organization does. And so having the sense of knowing what the strategy is, what KPIs are going to matter most for which tools, it's going to have to be a pretty strategic conversation. But monitoring it, making sure that the behaviors are occurring that you want to see in your sales organization with digital selling is absolutely what we're seeing in best practice.
Gotcha. No, those are really good indicators too. I think that kind of helps leaders on, hey, here's how I need to think about this topic. I mean, the digital selling topic, I would assume you're seeing it as well. I think everybody is experiencing a boom in it right now in terms of interest, because everybody's moved virtual to some degree or another.
I mean, just like this Zoom meeting we're having here, what KPI you'd want to know, what kind of KPIs you would have if this was me and you having a seller or customer conversation, right?
Yeah.
Or if I was doing a webinar, right? What are those outcomes I would need to expect from that, so that as a manager or as a sales leader, I know that we're making progress. Just tracking the number of meetings is not enough. It's what type of engagement indicators do you have there? What type of leads generated from the meetings are being are being generated from that, then we can start to have real good goal setting and accomplishments that we can share with the team and start seeing where progress is being made and what's working best.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, Ryan, just so you know, my KPI for this conversation is, do you, as the academic expert, drop some dynamic knowledge on people? So, and I feel pretty good about that. We're getting it right now. So, yeah, we're on track.
Awesome, Greg. Thanks.
Yeah. No, it's good. Hey, I know another area you've done some research in, and this is kind of a hot topic right now in many industries, is on this idea of kind of sales force downsizing and specifically what organizations emphasize in a process that can result in better performance. So I'm wondering, what advice can you provide an organization who might be going through downsizing or thinking about one right now?
So my downsizing is always a tricky topic, right? Nobody wants to talk about downsizing, although there's certainly circumstances often dictate that can be the case. I think my initial advice for companies thinking about downsizing, at least right now, is, and in particular, downsizing the sales organization, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the unique aspect to really think about. When you're downsizing sales, it's different than downsizing any other part of your organization. It's the first thing we have to establish. Because when we understand that sales is your conduit to customer value and having customer relationships, when you are cutting and severing those ties, that's a completely different type of downsizing than any other part of your organization. So the first thing you've got to do when you're thinking about downsizing is, if we're going to downsize sales, we've got to think about that differently. Because research consistently shows when we downsize sales, we get lots of drops in customer satisfaction. We create all kinds of customer uncertainty, right?
Yeah.
So that's the first caveat. Are we downsizing sales in particular? Because if we do, we're potentially damaging the top line.
Yeah, it sounds like there's always a trade-off of some sort that's negative.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky, right? Because sales is an expensive part of the organization, always is, right? We generate a lot of revenue, but we're also some of the more expensive employees in most organizations, right? So here's where the challenge comes in: is that a lot of CFOs, they'll look across the organization and they'll start to say, where should we cut? They say, well, these salespeople are really expensive. Why don't we cut some of those folks? And so we have to have this consideration here. Well, what are we losing if we cut the sales force, right? Because if we're about recovering quickly, if we're going to be about maintaining satisfied customers, cutting the sales force may not be the right avenue to go down. And one of the things we did in a study we did on downsizing was actually look at what actually happens to the stock market when a company decides to downsize their sales force. Because normally when you're downsizing, you're saying, well, we're going to do this, we're going to cut costs so that we can survive and have better financial performance, right? It will please our investors to know we're going to reduce our costs to perform better. But like I was talking about, the other side of that is that you're reducing your ability to generate revenue. So there's this very mixed signal, right, when you're cutting salespeople. And the market honestly doesn't know what to do with it. They don't have a lot of information otherwise. They just know you're cutting salespeople. So what we actually found was that the stock market goes wildly volatile when organizations cut their sales force. And so what's really important here is that leaders need to know when and what to be doing if they feel like downsizing is absolutely a necessity, right? One of the things we see is that you've got to send out signals that you're still going to be able to attract customers. You're still going to be competitive, right? It's the first thing.
Okay, so it's kind of this reassurance that, hey, if we as an organization are going to downsize sales, we need to make sure that we very directly address what could be this concern about customer service and customer loyalty and everything else.
Absolutely right. It's a signaling game. It's really what it comes down to, right? So because not everybody outside can see what's going on in your organization. They don't know why you've cut sales per se. So they want to have some signals of how are you going to be, if you're cutting sales, how are you going to continue to be competitive? How are you going to grow?
Yeah.
So one of the things we found is that signals like increasing your advertising or making cuts when there's not a lot of competition coming in, right? Not a lot of innovations, or it's pretty stale market can be helpful signal to show that you're still a player. You're still in the market. You're still going to have growth.
That's really good. And I think it's helpful, especially now, because I know organizations are downsizing, or if they're not downsizing, if an industry's hit, they're thinking about downsizing. And that if it's like you get in a perpetual cycle, you downsize, it hurts sales because of the customer issues. Then you're downside. I mean, you just get stuck. I've seen it many times in organizations. And what you're saying about, hey, you need to message this thing right is important. I guess the other thing I'd challenge organizations is, but man, you better think really hard before you downsize your sales team.
I would say it should be the last thing to go, right? Because essentially they're the ones bringing money in. Now you may have a strong e-commerce channel, and that's potentially another signal that you can compete well, right? But yeah, exactly. And research also shows you should tell your customers. You should actually, if you're going to downsize and you're going to maybe change. So if you're downsizing, more than likely, some of your salespeople they're not going to be working with that customer anymore, right? The customer's going to essentially have a replacement. That, or the salesperson they had now has an increased workload, right? Because they're picking up more customers. So in either case, right, there's going to be a shift in how that salesperson was serving that customer before. And so rather than just hiding that or just trying to make it work, it's what we've seen here and what research is showing is that actually having open communication about how that relationship may change, what to expect, can be more helpful for customers to, have less uncertainty about that relationship and stay with that company. Because otherwise, what you're seeing is there's a drop in service, there's drop in the relationship, and so customers end up bailing because they weren't getting the same level of relationship that they were before.
Yeah, no, that's good advice, especially with what everybody's dealing with right now. And then I've heard that before, and as you have emphasized it, the idea that the majority of the research, I think if I heard you right, suggest that downsizing sales teams doesn't help your business over time.
Well, so over time is tricky, right? So I think we got to still work on that question. I think what I would say is that downsizing sales has unintended consequences, right? Is that the way I would frame that?
Okay.
So for example, so when we downsize sales and the market gets more volatile, right? Well, that means you're a riskier bet, right? So if you're a big Fortune 500 company and you want to go invest and do some capital expenditures, that means you're going to have a higher rate you're going to have to pay for that financing, right? Because you're a riskier bet. Well, what we actually showed was that for a typical downsizing in the sample in our study, you would actually see that the cost savings from cutting salaries, okay, was actually cut in half once you factored in the additional capital expenses that were taken on due to rate increases. So, in other words, you've got 40 million that you're going to save from salaries being cut, right? But what you don't anticipate is that your rates for anything you're going to finance actually go up. You got 20 million extra you got to pay in financing. So that whole cost savings now, you just had it split right in half. And so, like I said, I think it's the unintended consequences like that, in addition to customer uncertainty, right? I'm not even talking about customer uncertainty and losing customer accounts.
Yeah.
But just from a financing perspective, right? These are some of the unintended consequences that leaders have to factor in when they're thinking about sales. So I think that the big takeaway, right, is you've got to think outside of just finance. You got to think outside the firm even. You got to think about your customers. You got to think about your value of your relationships before you go and touch sales.
Man, we appreciate you joining us in this episode of the Sales Scholars. I think the research you shared and just your own experiences is really valuable to our listeners. So thanks a lot for joining us.
Absolutely. Happy to get back to the program, and glad to see you're doing great things there, Craig.